Hi everyone, welcome back to Sports Psych. This is going to be the second part of Chapter 2. Sorry, the first video got truncated a little bit right at the end of what I was talking about in terms of the big 5 personality traits. So to start that from scratch, the big 5 personality traits was determined by using factor analysis and determining what the probably the best 5 ways of describing person's personality is on these 5 different axes. So the other thing that I mentioned is that the mnemonic for these big 5 is OCEAN. And it's an acronym where each of the 5 letters in OCEAN represent each of the different big 5 personality traits. All right, so the O stands for openness to experience. The C stands for conscientiousness. The E for extroversion. The A for agreeableness, and the N for neuroticism. Although, again, in terms of current psychological terms, we don't really use neuroticism as a clinical diagnosis, but it still is being used as a determination of these personality traits. Okay, so I think each one of those is pretty self-explanatory. The only thing that I have sort of fill in the blank things in terms of the PowerPoints, or have an asterisk next to a couple of those items, is how that relates to sports psych. Not too surprisingly, if somebody scores high on conscientiousness, they actually are more coachable. Also for agreeableness and low in neuroticism, if all those things exist, then that definitely is more likely to be coachable. So there is a number of different ways that the big 5 can be applied directly into sports psych. All right. The other thing in terms of traits, one trait that isn't actually part of the big 5, but is talked about in the chapter, is perfectionism. The key thing about perfectionism is that perfectionism sounds like it would be a good thing in terms of sport. Okay, pretty famously, Peyton Manning was considered to be very high in terms of perfectionism. Everything had to be right, had to be practiced over and over again until everything was actually perfect. And for him, it actually was pretty successful, obviously. Okay, but on the flip side of that, there is also a downside to perfectionism. If it's too overall consuming of the person, if everything had to go right and you couldn't adapt to things going wrong, then there actually is a downside to perfectionism. So again, if you read through the chapter a little bit, or maybe if you want to think about that as a term paper topic, that's great. So you can see that perfectionism, it does have, there can be good perfectionism or bad perfectionism. Right. The other thing in that chapter, right around the place of perfectionism, is mental toughness. Okay, so again, most of you have this idea or have heard of mental toughness, but in terms of psychology, we break it down into the 4 different components to show that there is multi-dimensional aspect to just feeling, oh, I just have to shake off injuries. Okay, well, there's also hope, optimism, resilience. Okay, so there are all these 4 different parts of mental toughness. Again, as I keep going through these chapters, start thinking about what you might want to do as a term paper project. Sometimes bleed into October or November, people are saying, well, I don't know what to do about my research project. Well, as we go through each of these chapters, or if you have another idea, that might be in a later chapter, start looking into it. Okay, so you may think, well, this chapter is particularly interesting in terms of perfectionism. I know somebody, or maybe I feel like I have some sort of perfectionism traits. Delve into that more if that's something that's of interest to you. All right, so, or mental toughness. Okay, that's another thing that, again, if you didn't know that there were different dimensions to mental toughness, then maybe that's something you want to do for your term paper. All right, so that's a wrap in terms of the trait theory. The next part of the chapter deals with the assessment or the different types of personality tests. Okay, so in psych, one of the major types of personality tests, or actually let me start with the different distinctions. There's 2 different classifications, major classifications of personality tests. What's known as projective tests and also self-report measures. Okay, so let's do with self-report measures first. Basically, self-report measures are paper and pencil tests. Okay, so you have a bunch of different questions of some sort of or another, and you answer those questions. You are self-reporting how you feel or what your behavior would be. So probably the most famous of the personality tests in psychology is the MMPI, and this says around 500 different items, and for each of the items you have to answer whether that statement is true of you, false of you, or you don't know. Okay, so items that, again, I have on the PowerPoints would be something like, I feel like someone's out to get me. Well, that's not too thinly veiled as a way of measuring paranoia. Okay, or I like school is another one. You would answer yes, no, it's true of me, false of me, or I can't say. And that would be a way of testing um, your need for achievement, okay, or need for affiliation to be with other people. All right, so there's a number of different items that you would have to answer. Again, each of the different types of personality traits would be emerged from each of those different questions, or the subclass of questions or subsets of questions. All right, so that's the one of the paper and pencil tests. And that one's general. Moving to one that's more specific is the athletic motivation inventory, that you have a couple of sample questions of that in the book. Again, I think just looking at those items will give you a sense of, again, how anybody, would be taking that test would, be reflecting how motivated they are for that particular sport. Okay, then the last one that's mentioned, actually it's not the last one, but another one mentioned is the Wonderlic test. This is really interesting. I think for a lot of you who actually follow football, you've probably heard of the Wonderlic test as, stated that way. So different, during training, during draft time, the different players may be tested on this Wonderlic test, and you may hear, well, this person had a high Wonderlic score, low Wonderlic score. Okay, pretty famously, one person, speaking of my Bills hat for you people who have been around the Bills for a while, one of the NFL players who scored the highest ever on the Wonderlic test, as I'm phrasing it right now, is Ryan Fitzpatrick, who had a nice stint with the Bills and now on the Dolphins. Okay, but he scored very high. Again, you might know that he went to Harvard as well. Okay, other people, Cam Newton, for example, obviously doing well with the Patriots right now, scored lower. Okay, so you may wonder about the validity, not the validity so much as the usefulness, let's phrase it that way, of the Wonderlic in terms of identifying NFL talent. Okay. But that question, that the Wonderlic test, as they give it to the NFL players, is not a personality test. It's more of a SAT type of question test. More word problems, more logic problems. So that's not really relevant in most cases to what an NFL player does, and certainly it's not a personality test. Okay, the Wonderlic is actually a testing company, so it's really a shorthand when they use it in terms of the Wonderlic test in terms of the NFL. It's not a personality test. The Wonderlic as a personality test, if you go to their website, is a true personality test. It actually is based on this big 5 personality traits. Okay, so it's a very, very different test than what you hear about when NFL draft time comes around. Okay, so that it's important to make that distinction. Just because somebody says the Wonderlic test, it doesn't mean it's the personality test. You really have to determine which type of test is given by this Wonderlic company. All right. The last one that is listed is the profile mood states. And this one has a really neat implication for sport. But the profile mood states, again, paper and pencil test, and basically what they're testing for the profile mood states are 7 different types of personality traits. Okay, so it's vigor, depression, fatigue, anger, confusion, and tension. Okay, so those are the 7 different things that are being tested with this profile of mood states. What's neat about this and how it applies to sports psych directly is what's known as the iceberg profile. That is, if you take elite athletes and compare them to just regular average athletes, let's phrase it that way, you get this little peak, okay, with just one of these traits, and that's vigor. Everything else is below average, but then it peaks way above average for vigor. Okay, so as you can see in the book, you basically have a lot below average performance, and then this peak of the iceberg, if you will, for vigor, sticking above all the other average athletes. Okay, so the average athletes are actually higher in terms of everything else but vigor. Okay, but then vigor is again really spiking for the more elite athletes. Okay. All right, so that's the profile of mood states. Again, paper and pencil test, okay, as were the others that I just mentioned. Okay. All right, so the next classification of personality tests are the projective tests. Okay, basically, again, I mentioned this in terms of Freudian theory. Freud's defense mechanism of projection is when you take your own unconscious feelings and attitudes and project them to another person. Well, in this particular case, you're projecting your own unconscious feelings and attitudes to a picture that you're given. Okay, so the one that you're probably most familiar with is the Rorschach inkblot test. So you're getting this inkblot, and the person taking the test has to describe what's going on in that picture, in that inkblot. And the way the interpreter would analyze your answers would be in terms of Freudian theory. So if you describe that inkblot as having some sort of violent themes or aggressive themes, that would fit what they would think of in terms of your personality. Right. So again, this idea of how you're describing this inkblot would be a way of assessing what your personality is. Okay. Similarly, is the thematic apperception test, or the TAT. Right. In this particular case, you're given a realistic looking picture. Okay. Think of it, one way I'd like to describe it is think of it as a single scene in a movie. And what you're asked to do is describe what's happening in that scene, in that picture, what happened before that, and what's going to happen next. All right. So in that particular regard, again, in terms of projection, you're projecting your own unconscious feelings and attitudes into this story, basically, that you're telling about this picture. Okay. And again, it seems, on the surface, well, how much information could you get, or is it just about the content? There is a lot of different scoring that does go on in terms of both of these projective tests. So it's not just how it's reported, but it's things like, in terms of the Rorschach, things about whether you imbue color into your description. Do you see motion that isn't actually there, but do you describe motion? Okay, so there's a lot of different things going on besides just the content. All right. Okay, so in terms of the personality tests in general, what are some of the downsides of each? What are some of the positive things about each? Basically, for the pen and paper test, okay, one of the problems is that the answers could be not so truthful, whether consciously or unconsciously. So one of the things that's mentioned there, and you may have run into this in your social psych classes or maybe even research methods, is the idea of social desirability. Somebody may answer a question on the any of these paper and pencil tests in the socially desirable way, or what you think the test taker wants you to say, or what you think society basically wants you to say. Okay, and you can fake good, and you can also fake bad, which sounds sort of weird. But if you were faking good in terms of a sports psych situation, if somebody was asking about your motivation, your anxiety level, okay, you could just say, yeah, I'm fine, even though your anxiety level is really high. Okay, or if if your anxiety was under control, but you really didn't want to play for whatever reason, you could say, yeah, my anxiety is really high. So again, there is this idea of faking good, faking bad, in the case that the answers could not be actually truthful, or again, not in touch with reality. All right. So the bottom line here is basically don't just follow one test. Okay, as you can probably guess with the Wonderlic. Okay, don't just assess a quarterback in terms of one test like the Wonderlic, or don't assess a person's personality on just the Wonderlic or the AMI or the MMPI. Take a bunch of different tests and try to get converging answers as to what that person's personality is. Okay, all right. So I'm going to stop here, and so there is going to be a part 3 to chapter 2, and this is where I'll talk directly about how research in personality has been applied to sport performance and sport teams. Okay, thanks everybody, and I'll give you another little bit of chapter 2 a little later on. Okay, thanks. Have a great day.